Maggie Harper stared at the worn map in her hands, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the route to the small town of Willow Creek. The decision to move had been impulsive, born out of grief and a desperate need for escape. It had been a year since her son, Jacob, passed away, and the weight of his absence had become unbearable in the city. The constant reminders, the empty bedroom, the playground they used to visit, felt like wounds that refused to heal. Willow Creek was the kind of place people went to disappear. Nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests, it was quiet, isolated, and far removed from the life Maggie had left behind. The house she'd rented was a modest cottage at the edge of town, its charm lying in its simplicity. When she arrived, the air smelled of pine and earth, the silence broken only by the occasional chirp of a bird. It felt like a place where she could finally breathe again. The locals were polite but reserved. At the general store, Maggie met Mrs. Connolly, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "You're new here," she said, handing Maggie her change. "What brings you to Willow Creek?" "Just needed a fresh start," Maggie replied, avoiding the woman's piercing gaze. Mrs. Connolly nodded knowingly but said nothing more. As Maggie left the store, she noticed a small wooden doll sitting on the counter. It was roughly carved, featureless except for a pair of hollow indentations where eyes might have been. She felt a chill run down her spine. The dolls were everywhere, she realized as she walked through town. They sat on porches, hung from trees, and even lined the windows of the church. They were eerily uniform, their blank faces giving nothing away. That night, as Maggie unpacked, she found a similar doll sitting on the windowsill of her bedroom. She hadn't noticed it before, and a prick of unease crept over her. She placed it in a drawer, telling herself it was just a harmless trinket left behind by the previous tenant. But as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The following days were uneventful, but Maggie couldn't ignore the oddities of Willow Creek. The townsfolk seemed friendly enough, yet there was an undercurrent of secrecy in their interactions. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously when she asked about the dolls. When she mentioned the one she'd found in her cottage, they offered only vague reassurances. "They're just traditions," said Tom, the postman. "Nothing to worry about." But Maggie did worry. She began noticing other strange occurrences. The way the forest seemed unnaturally quiet at night, the faint scratching sounds that came from inside the walls, and the whispers she thought she heard when the wind blew through the trees. The dolls seemed to multiply, appearing in places she swore she hadn't seen them before. One morning, she found a new one on her front porch, its head tilted slightly to the side as if studying her. Determined to distract herself, Maggie began exploring the woods behind her house. The air was crisp, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. As she wandered deeper, she stumbled upon a clearing. At its center stood a crude altar made of stone, surrounded by dozens of the wooden dolls. They were arranged in a circle, their hollow faces turned toward the altar. Maggie's stomach churned. She felt like an intruder in a sacred space, and the oppressive silence made her skin crawl. She backed away, nearly tripping over a root, and hurried home. That night, she dreamed of Jacob. He stood at the edge of the clearing, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're watching." Maggie woke with a start, her heart racing. The doll she had placed in the drawer was sitting on her nightstand, its hollow eyes fixed on her. Maggie couldn't ignore the growing unease. She began digging into Willow Creek's history, visiting the library and poring over old records. What she found only deepened her dread. The town had been founded in the early 1800s by a group of settlers fleeing persecution. According to the records, they believed the land was sacred, protected by ancient spirits. To honor these spirits, they created the wooden dolls, the hollow ones, as vessels for the spirits to inhabit. The dolls were said to guard the town, ensuring its prosperity and safety. But there were darker stories, too. Tales of accidents, disappearances, and tragedies that always seemed to coincide with someone disrespecting the dolls. One account spoke of a farmer who burned a hollow one in a fit of rage, only to vanish the next day. His body was never found, but his screams were said to echo through the woods on moonless nights. Maggie also discovered a journal belonging to a woman named Eleanor, who had lived in Willow Creek decades earlier. Eleanor wrote of hearing voices, seeing shadows move where no one stood, and feeling an invisible presence watching her. Her final entry read, "The Hollow Ones are not protectors. They demand something in return." That night, Maggie locked the doll in a chest and placed it in the attic. She hoped that out of sight meant out of mind. But as she lay in bed, she heard faint footsteps on the roof, followed by a soft tapping on her window. The incidents escalated. Maggie awoke one morning to find scratches on her arms, as though she had been clawed in her sleep. The dolls began appearing inside her home, despite her efforts to get rid of them. She threw one into the woods, only to find it sitting on her kitchen table the next day, its hollow eyes seeming to mock her. The townsfolk grew colder, their polite smiles fading when she asked for help. Mrs. Connolly muttered something about the balance, and warned Maggie not to anger the Hollow Ones. Even Tom, who had been friendly, avoided her now. Maggie's breaking point came when she heard Jacob's voice again. This time, it wasn't in a dream. She was washing dishes when she heard him call out, faint and distant, "Mom, help me." She ran outside, following the voice into the woods. It led her to the clearing, where the altar now held a new doll, one that resembled Jacob. Maggie's knees buckled as she realized the truth. The Hollow Ones were more than wooden dolls. They were vessels for the souls of the lost, trapped and bound to the town's dark traditions. As she stood frozen in the clearing, the dolls began to move. Their heads turned toward her, their hollow eyes filling with a dim, flickering light. A low, guttural hum emanated from the altar, and Maggie felt an invisible force pressing down on her, suffocating and relentless. She fled, the sound of the dolls' whispers following her all the way home. Maggie knew she couldn't stay in Willow Creek, but leaving wasn't as simple as packing a bag. The Hollow Ones wouldn't let her go, not without a fight. She spent the next day preparing, gathering supplies and researching rituals in Eleanor's journal. If the Hollow Ones demanded a balance, she would find a way to tip the scales. That night, armed with a lantern, salt, and a knife, Maggie returned to the clearing. The dolls were waiting, their positions more menacing than before. The altar pulsed with an otherworldly energy, the hum louder and more insistent. Maggie stepped into the circle and poured a line of salt around her. She held the knife tightly, her hands shaking. "You won't take me," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. "And you won't take Jacob." The dolls reacted immediately. Their hollow eyes glowed brighter, and their wooden limbs creaked as they began to move. Shadows spilled from the forest, coalescing into figures that loomed over the clearing. Maggie recited the incantation she had found in the journal, her voice rising above the hum. The shadows recoiled, and the dolls froze in place. The altar cracked, a blinding light spilling from within. The force pressing against her lifted, replaced by an ear-piercing wail that seemed to come from the dolls themselves. When the light faded, the clearing was empty. The dolls were gone, the altar reduced to rubble. Maggie fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She felt an overwhelming sense of peace, as though Jacob's spirit had been released. The next morning, she packed her belongings and left Willow Creek. The town was eerily quiet as she drove away, the windows of the cottages dark. As she reached the edge of the forest, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a single doll sitting on the road, its hollow eyes watching her. Maggie didn't stop. She kept driving, determined to leave the Hollow Ones behind. But deep down, she knew their presence would haunt her forever.